I recognize we don't have as much time as really this deserves, because we've seen so many interesting threads brought up here tonight. The first thing that strikes me is the importance of the module in design, and how this is sort of the thing that links all of what's been said tonight. And I think it's very important to look at Rohde's role as somebody who brought what I think had precedents in Europe that go back prior to World War I, to bring that into an American context and find a way to adapt it to Americans in a way that was acceptable. And Phyllis, I'd like you to just say a little bit about how you perceived Rohde's role as sort of the go-between between European modernism and American modernism, since obviously he understood what was going on in Europe.
Right. I think I have a microphone.
You're lavalier. Okay, yeah. I forgot. You were pinned earlier.
Okay. Well, first of all, when I showed the modular units of Marcel Breuer, I was trying to kind of race through and not. Those were made of metal. When Rohde made modular furniture, he used wood. And part of that idea, I think, was that people would be more comfortable. I'm not sure that he would have ever even considered using metal, but that wood was familiar and people were comfortable with that. So that was one, and also Le Corbusier, who also designed modular units that were shown, in fact, at the 1925 Paris Exposition. Those were metal as well. So that was one big change, one way that he took a European idea as it had evolved in the 1920s, because of course Bruno Paul started out with wood. So that's one thing that he did. And whereas the Le Corbusier and Breuer units were devoid of ornament, Rohde did a few things that I think we would call decorative. Some of the handles, quite beautiful, decorative, but also added to a design flow and added to an overall aesthetic.
Well, Pablo, you talked about this aesthetic component occurring almost accidentally in your work, but quite compellingly. Is that? I mean, what's the purity of your vision here? I mean, what can you tell us about your working method and how you visualize this whole process? Because I think it's really compelling, especially what you just showed us in terms of, I think everybody in this room can get a feel for the impact of prefabricated modular design in our current environment. And I feel like we're finally getting to the payoff of something that's been around since the 20s, really. But the irony of the MoMA show was it showed how unsuccessful it's been for most of the 20th century.
Am I heard?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, the issue of the role of prefabrication in design, I think is very complex, because I was just listening to Phyllis and I was thinking, okay, well, it was unadorned in Europe, and then it was added ornamentation when it came to the United States. So then I was, all of a sudden that made me think about the difficulty that modern architecture still has in the United States, right? I just came from a meeting yesterday. I was telling you where we met this client for this church, which is a big community. We had a meeting with 50 people. It was a great client meeting with 50 people, and they were very supportive. But there was one lady that regretted that the new building didn't look more like the barn, like the old building, and she wanted to know why did it depart from the barn? How come we made a conscious decision of not continue with the architecture of the barn? And so there's a sense that in the United States there's a harder sell still now today for modern architecture. But when it comes, but I think that's a little bit deceiving, because I think the position that you are remarking upon regarding the holes and the quote-unquote unintentional ornamentation. When an archetypical American, right? I mean, if we talk from the point of view of design, perhaps one of the best known Americans, Buckminster Fuller, said that he never thought about beauty when he was working in a project. That he thought about, you know, efficiency and practicality and economy. But when he saw the finished work, if it wasn't beautiful, he knew that he had failed. So in a way, the beauty became a kind of a consequence and not an objective, right? So in a way, I think this idea that ornamentation is not intentional, but it is there because the process has a certain integrity. Is an American idea too, in a way. So it's hard. And then, but the other thing is that, you know, it is said the situation is such because America is a new beginning, right? And is a kind of empty place in which everybody can find their sort of realize their dreams. And for people that have been running away from hardship or oppression and come to America, it is said that people want to have what they didn't have. And one of my clients explains that that's why people like new cars and old houses, you know, because people that have new houses are people that cannot afford old ones, you know. And I was in a meeting last year talking about modular housing, which is houses that are built in a factory in modules that can be up to 50 feet long, 12 feet wide. We did a project for Pratt Institute using that module, and there was a meeting organized by one of the manufacturers, and there were, I don't know, like 40 architects in the room, and this manufacturer wanted to know from the architects why they thought that modular housing, which was being very successful in Great Britain, had such a problem in the United States. And I was shocked to see that half of the architects were proposing schemes by virtue of which the modularity of the housing will disappear. And once we have achieved that disappearance of that modularity, the modular housing will become successful. In other words, it's a kind of camouflage scheme, right? And you know, we made the argument with Jennifer that the real future of modular housing was in how could modular housing create a house that you could not create in any other way, and express itself through that. You know, give it a kind of, as Ayse was saying, a kind of humanistic approach. How not think about the product, but think about how people are going to live in it, and what does modular housing give them as an opportunity that traditional housing doesn't. You know?
That makes me think that maybe the sales tool is showing construction, because Americans do have this feeling for what I like to call the verisimilitude, you know, the sort of show me thing, and revealed construction may be sort of the foot in the door to get them to accept an unornamented style, but it has been a struggle, and that camouflage continues. Do you have something you want to say in reaction to that?
Actually, I loved what you said, because I was just making a note about, what's great about modularity is that it gives you the flexibility that allows you to adapt the system to different users. So you're offering, different users something that's closer to their needs, and in a work environment, the user could be the corporation. So you need to adapt to the needs of the corporation, but the end user is also the person, a woman or a man that spends, a lot of time at that station, and so adapting to their needs, which might not necessarily be parallel to the corporation's needs. So the system, I think, gives you the flexibility to manage a lot of opposing criteria in a very economical way. And in a way, it also opens the door to customization that's affordable, because you can create, and I think some of your designs have this as well, where once you define what the common parts are,
Right.
You can then change the skins or sizes. Allows you customization that you might not have otherwise been able to afford or imagine. So it's.
And I do think that this is a distinction sort of between architectural practice and product design, because looking at the individual components, for instance, of your Teneo line, I mean, these are individual things you can take and show individually, and they're beautiful formally.
Yeah.
There is a difference in the field that I think is important, but we're also looking at Rohde as bridging sort of these, and the creation, I guess, maybe for the first time in America, of sort of environments. Don't you think, Phyllis? I mean, other than exhibition design and historical interiors, I can't think of that much that really anticipates what Rohde was doing in the Herman Miller work.
Yeah, and I think especially the office furniture is really getting closer to the idea of an environment, because that would have been, a whole space configured, as you were saying, to the individual needs of the person, taking into account how that person needed to work, whether they need a huge flat surface, if they were an engineer or an architect, or a more modest space, depending on the kind of work that was being done. And the idea with his furniture systems also was that as your needs changed, you would add to what you had already purchased. And in conjunction with that, he was quite dedicated to style stability, to the idea that he wasn't just designing a line of furniture that would be marketed one year and replaced the next year with a new line.
Which you pointed out in another lecture was Herman Miller's practice, and part of the bind they were in was this rapid turnover of historical styles.
Right. Well, that was the standard procedure in the furniture industry, was that you produced a line and it was available for 2 or 3 years. In fact, 3 years would be considered rather long. The East India Laurel Group that I talked about in a little bit of detail was actually in production for 10 years. That was a remarkably long time, and I think it may have even only been discontinued because metal was no longer available during the war.
I think we've seen the value of the outside point of view, which is something that Rohde was definitely telling Herman Miller he was bringing, and I think we've all seen that as a common theme here. But I was reminded when you were talking that Morrison Cousins gave a lecture here about 10 years ago or so, and the phrase that he used that has stuck in my mind ever since, he said, "Prowess is through analysis." And that's a powerful little phrase, and I think if we might talk about how analysis and developing analysis works both in your own careers. And Phyllis, maybe you'd start about, I mean, I definitely feel Rohde's analytical ability in breaking down sort of like aspects of the workplace and finding a way to address those through creation of these modules. But I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah. Well, he was he considered himself to be a very careful student of how people lived. He observed how people lived and thought about, what kind of furniture is going to work with how people live now and how they'll live in the future. And he very much wanted to come up with designs that addressed those new ways of living, such as the one-room apartment. That would be a perfect example. He, designed furniture that would work in this very small space, but had a lot of flexibility, with tables that could be reduced in size, and, furniture that had dual purposes.
Pablo, would you like to say anything? Yeah. My favorite Gilbert Rohde piece, I think it's probably not be surprising, is the molded plexiglass chair, because you can almost see through it and you might miss it, And I think the analysis, the whole thing about analysis and about system is something that obviously has a moment in the process of design. And it's almost a moment of orchestration, you know, it's a moment that I think is best concealed, which doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that it's hidden, but I think it's developed to a point in which it becomes, in which it's not evident. Because I think that, and this might be, as I was saying earlier, another atrophiation of architecture. You know, it's the fact that architects think that every piece is special because it exists in a part of the world that it's unique, right? It's not like chairs that you can move them around, and that might change, but you know, that is the traditional view. So the idea of repetition or reevaluated repetition becomes repugnant because it removes that uniqueness and creates a kind of homogeneity in the world. But it's undeniable that this is a technological society, and the things that get built need to be mechanically built, and that requires a kind of system, you know, a different kind of system. Now, the situation, obviously, and you know, we've been talking about this for almost 10 years, is computers revolutionized that, right? You can have systems that are different. You can have a changing repetition, and you can give people choice, right? But I think the more interesting issue is the issue of, at least for architecture, the possibility of expression of something that is in place. You know, you think another difference is that with design is that I think, or at least in my mind, or from our point of view, you don't invent anything when you design a building, but you sort of go to a place and find something that is there, that it doesn't necessarily have to be only physical. It could have to do with the program and the aspirations of a client, but there's also something there in the place, and the project just makes it possible. It just sort of appears, right? So so there's a kind of uniqueness to each part of the process that I think has a love-hate relationship with the idea of system. Yeah.
So your point makes me think of something, Phyllis, you also mentioned in one of the things that Rohde instilled at Herman Miller was the idea that design innovation also requires innovative merchandising, which requires salesmen that understand design. And this is thinking that's so ahead of its time, yet so still true today. And so I think his analysis was not limited to industrial design or furniture design, but to the whole process of how do you bring innovation, well, how do you create innovation, and how do you bring it and make it successful. And when you were showing his graphic design, you know, you can see the creative thinking at every level and consistently so, which makes it very powerful.
And just the idea that you coordinate all of that. You know, you look for that pretty much in vain in the 1920s, and then suddenly in the 1930s, you know, by the end of the decade, we've mastered it.
Yeah.
You know, it's a fantastic development, and it's one of the things that I've tried to emphasize is really part of our heritage in the United States and a very important part of it. We've got about 8 minutes left, so I'd like to open this up to questions from the floor. I'm sure there's some burning questions out there. Would anybody like to place one?
You could have 4 2-minute questions or 1 8-minute question.
Yes.
Well, I'll just take a stab at that prefabricated issue you raised. Prefabricated homes, for example, have gotten kind of a bad image over the years simply because I think the unions are against it. The real estate community downgrades them a little bit. look at Levittown. And of course, architects are shying away from that because that means less business for architects. Mass production of furniture is one thing, but mass production of homes, in a sense, there's some negative connotations among many interest groups. And I don't know if you feel that those are three main influences that have kind of downgraded that concept a little bit.
Well, I can tell you that it did have a great deal to do with killing a lot of the major projects that were on the boards during World War II. I mean, most of the major industrial designers had some scheme for mass-produced housing. There was Buckminster Fuller, there was Donald Deskey, there was Henry Dreyfuss, there was Walter Dorman Teague. All had their proposals. None of them really went anywhere, with the exception of Deskey's pretty modest schemes for shelter industries. But the unions did pose a remarkably difficult and, in fact, insoluble problem. Where I come from in North Carolina, changing it from mobile home to manufactured housing was considered a real revolution in marketing. And there has always been, I would say, in certain areas of the country, a little bit of a feeling that you wanted to get out of the trailer as quickly as you could. Maybe we're turning the corner on that because people have less associations with that kind of thing. I'm not sure. Please.
Yeah, no, I think, but if you think of the vast majority of the homes that get built today in the United States, or, up until before the crisis, let's say, they are all mass-produced. It is, maybe they're not produced industrially, they're made of wood by hand with traditional methods, but it is not like each one of those houses employs an architect, So from the point of view of business for architects, it doesn't make much of a difference.
Lee Rohde?
If you go into a home today, let's call this a middle-class home, and you look at the bathroom, the kitchen, the laundry, you will see primarily the fairly advanced design, functional, what we would call modern, maybe not the very latest, but certainly clearly of a very modern level. Now if you go into the bedroom or the living room, you may not know what century you're in. Do you have any comment on the way we look at modern design in the home? In the office it's quite different, but in the way we look at modern design versus traditional design, in which rooms we furnish in which way and why?
Who'd like to start? Well, I'd be happy to. Henry Dreyfuss said modern design came into the American home through the kitchen and the bathroom, and I think it's still that way. You can sell Americans on conveniences, but style it's a live wire. It really is. And I am constantly surprised by how tenaciously Americans hang on to style, especially in the living room. And I think it's because it has replaced in their minds the parlor. And when you think of the Victorian parlor in the American home, you begin to get an idea of how important that was as representing the family, And representing the family in a neutral, modern, functional environment maybe just doesn't work for them because it's not deep enough and historical enough and maybe meaningful enough. I don't know. What are your reactions? Phyllis, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think that it's a very complicated issue as to, what are the reasons that people select different kinds of styles for their living room, let's say. But I do think that a place like IKEA, which I was hoping we might have time to talk about that, but I think that modern design actually is accepted more today than it ever has been. But it's not universally chosen. And people maybe find references to the past comforting, or maybe it connects them with a sort of historical idea of what it, I mean, I know that, for example, in the 1930s or later, sometimes people who had newly arrived in the United States particularly wanted colonial revival furniture to establish their American identity as quickly as possible. So
And indeed, Walter Dorwin Teague's home in Flemington, New Jersey had no modern design and was completely furnished in American antiques. And look at Laurel Guild, who basically dropped industrial design to go into historic preservation, et cetera. So there's a very interesting relationship with this, and it's a little bit fraught, I think, because modern and American colonial were on the scene at the same time and really battling for the same audience in a sense.
So one thing that, if I could add to that, I'm actually very optimistic about the where homes are going to go, and I think it's going to happen through technology. The reason that it happened in bathrooms and in kitchens is because plumbing technology changed, bathrooms followed, cooking technology changed. We brought appliances and new technology into the kitchen. And I think now through technology, whether it's the computer technology or flat screens, the way we entertain ourselves and get information, I think that will push a very different sort of living into our homes. And it's not, I don't think it's going to come through furniture, it's going to come through new information technology, new materials, and also how we interact with technology in a similar way that technology has changed how we print things. I think in how we take on, every one of us, designer capabilities in terms of how we edit text, how we manipulate photography, make albums. I think that is going to move into all the other aspects of our life. It's this field that stood still for a long time, and I think it's on the brink of incredible change, which is very exciting.
I think along with this idea of technology changing is also the way our lifestyles have changed. Family living is different. Women are not home. There aren't servants. Women come home from work and they want to quickly make dinner. They want to entertain in the kitchen. We're designing houses now without formal dining room, without dining rooms, because people don't even entertain that way anymore. And I think the whole open plan of a house now is really something that people finally want. So,
Yeah, good point.
Any reflections on that?
I can just nod.
I think what you've said is very true. Yes, yes, in the back.
Yes, I think it's absolutely amazing that we've had this discussion for almost an hour, and no one has breached the subject of these socioeconomic factors, which went into why the design of people like Gilbert Rohde came about in the first place. And as far as talking about the issue of mass-produced housing in this country, I think that there's a little amnesia going on here. Having come from California, there was something called the Eichler home, which was extremely successful. I believe there were over 400 or 500 of these homes that were built, to say nothing of the arts and architecture program of the case study houses in Southern California. So I think I'd like to hear some more from the panelists with regard to the socioeconomic factors that really, to my way of thinking, were a wellstream for the change that took place in the type of furniture and interiors that took place just prior to and after World War II. Thank you.
Go ahead. Go
It'll
ahead.
be really short. So I'm glad that you brought that up because one of the things that I read about the relationship about Rohde and Herman Miller was it was a relationship that was based on mutual desperation because they, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think they met in 1930. Gilbert Rohde
Yeah.
was, taking around his designs. That was kind of the height of recession, basically. Herman Miller was, the Dupuis were desperate because they couldn't sell their, highly ornate, highly, quite expensive wood furniture. And Rohde was desperate because he had a vision that nobody wanted to buy, and it, in a way, out of this crisis that is quite similar to our situation today, came the birth of modern design and Herman Miller as we understand today, and the whole vision of what modern furniture is, that in its simplicity, honesty, and just doing away with ornamentation was born. So I just wanted to, with that.
Well, I think there was an aspect of modern aspirations that are that have to do with doing away with the way that we have framed this conversation from the beginning. We started talking about this in terms of people being amenable to modern design, by that meaning a modernist design or a modern style of design in certain certain rooms of the house and not in other rooms of the house. So we're talking about modernism versus the traditional historical style. But if we talk about modernity and the project of modernity, it includes the idea that we would do away with the idea of style. That organically, out of the production of a certain artifact by virtue of the technology used, the artifact would have a certain expression that would have not to do with a ornamental intention. And I think in that sense, the last 50 years do not give reason to be more optimistic, although you're very optimistic, because I think we've taken a step back from that. And I think that the fact that we're here talking about modernism and not about modernity is an example of the fact that we're talking about the fact that an object is designed in a certain way as a look that the object has, and if you think about the way that homes get designed, we're involved in a lot of projects, and people that are well off enough to hire an architect many a times also choose to take away the interior design from the architect and hire an interior designer, which is, an interior designer is something akin to a manufacturer of a fake past for the people that live in the house. People want a look, and we have walked into apartments in which people were considered hiring us that for different projects that had been done recently by interior designers, and the people in the apartment still had portraits. There was a wall of portraits, and there were still photos that come with the frame. So this this kind of thing is quite complex. But I think that if the idea of modernity and design also was intimately linked, at least in Europe, with the idea of a social revolution. The way that people would live would allow them to realize themselves as human beings and to have more time to spend in leisure and education. And this is obviously not the world in which we live today. To run around like crazy just to survive. And I have nothing against these people that had to hire an interior decorator to breathe some life into their own homes. I was riding in the subway today and sort of spacing out, looking at the advertisement in the subway. There was an advertisement about the island of Aruba, and there was somebody in the picture who was a wedding planner. And all of a sudden, it shocked me to think that why can people plan their own weddings? How can a profession of a wedding planning be something that makes sense nowadays, you know? I mean, that's a particular stage of perception that brings you, obviously there's nothing wrong with wedding planners. If there's one here, everything is cool, you know, but sometimes you fall into the situations in which you start thinking, well, this is really strange, you know? I mean, this is not where we thought we were going 50 years ago. Sure. Anyways.
Phyllis, I think why don't you sum this up for us in a
Well,
neat
I'm not sure I'm
package
going
and
to
put a bow
sum it
on
up in a neat package, but I want to respond to the last question to say that the Depression actually worked in Gilbert Rohde's favor in that it was a time when these manufacturers were looking for something new to stimulate sales. And what was new was modern design. And when he and D.J. Dupree, the head of Herman Miller, got together, after a couple of years, Dupree decided that maybe it was worthwhile to take a chance on these modern designs since they were about to go out of business anyway. And because it was wood furniture, the startup costs were not prohibitive to make just a couple of model suites. And the reaction of the public was very positive, and so modern design was launched at Herman Miller. But Rohde also introduced modern design at several other manufacturers where it was also successful. And some of the furniture that he designed was very moderately priced. In fact, in 1940, he actually came out with a line of furniture that was planned for public housing and for people on a very, very limited budget, as well as Herman Miller furniture, which was much more of a high-end product. It wasn't, you couldn't really say that it was cheap. It was moderately priced, but it was not cheap. And he did feel that his approach to furniture design had a social value in that he was meeting needs that people had for the way they lived now, providing efficiency and functionality and so forth. There were socioeconomic concerns that were very much in his mind when he was working.
I think we're almost at 8:30 now, so that's almost 2 hours. So I think we'll adjourn, and thank you very much.
Good.